So it's the early hours of the 1st of February 2020. Um, what's interesting about tonight's development is that the European Union kind of tried to tone it down, the significance of it. Obviously, there is this transition period, but nevertheless, this is a historic and poignant moment. All of the British press was covering this today as their headlines, understandably so. What I want to do here is talk a bit about why I think the European Union has lost one of its major member states. I think this is important because without understanding the reasons for Brexit, the EU is going to see itself collapse. And even Merkel basically came close to conceding this a while back, a few weeks ago, I understand. Because it's a misconception that it's just the pesky British versus Europe. Firstly, Europe and the EU, of course, that is not the same thing, and I think it is extremely important that commentators differentiate when they're talking about this sort of language, because we have not left Europe. Unless there's some tectonic plate shift, we are part of the European continent. We're an island, but we are culturally part of the European continent, and geographically as well. Obviously, there are many reasons why people voted the way they did. I know why I voted Remain, because I felt that there were too many question marks about leaving, but we have left now, and with that, I'm prepared to be optimistic and I'm prepared to be open-minded about that. I really don't think that it's not just that I don't like the idea of doom mongering. I think it is not showing the whole picture. Let's give this a chance. But there are issues about the European Union I do deeply dislike. What I like about the European Union is some of the values it has. And even Boris Johnson said this. He respects some of the values that the European Union promotes. They do put emphasis on such issues as human rights. That's to be admired. And it is irrefutable, although many would say it's also down to NATO, that Europe has been the most peaceful and prosperous continent in the world. Prosperous insofar as collectively prosperous. Obviously, there's richer individual states, but no other region on earth can match Europe for relative political stability and basically peace. No two EU member states have been at war with one another since the Second World War. Not significant war. There's been obviously some fishing disputes and so on, but the notion of Britain and Spain, for example, going to war is unthinkable, and I think it's still unthinkable over, say, Gibraltar. That is, to me, something to be admired about the European Union. But at some point, this ceased to be simply an economic trading union, and it became a project for, let's face it, United States of Europe. Now, I'll be honest, I wanted to put that to the back of my mind. I wanted to think, well, it's only a minority who are really pushing that. The problem is they were quite a vocal minority. And there was this obvious contempt for anyone who saw things differently. They were dismissed as petty nationalists. They were dismissed as bigoted, even. I think the idea of the United States of Europe, it sounds nice. And I think there's many ways that our countries can work very closely together, not just closely, very closely, but not to the price of sovereignty. I mean, a United States of Europe, such a concept, where would the capital be? There'd be forever disputes over whether it's Paris or Berlin. Many people would say Paris is a cultural capital, Berlin's a financial capital, but then Madrid, Athens, Rome would have something to say about that. The Eternal City, they would have a good claim to being the capital of Europe. So even something as basic as that, as elementary as that, would be a big question mark. Brussels itself is not a particularly exciting city. compared to other great European cities. So I think that push towards a United States of Europe made a lot of people wary. And this is not just a British phenomenon. I suspect there are many people in France and Italy and other European states who are also very wary of that. Much less so in Germany, but certainly in the south of the continent, and even in the new member states where there is strong civic nationalism. Um, the sense of nationhood, particularly as they are on the periphery of Putin's Russia, the sense of nationhood is very, very strong for those countries, understandably so. So the failure of the EU to really respect this, I think, has been one big factor. EU bureaucracy hasn't helped. The fact that, for example, there is so many quotas and so many regulations over products from the European Union, which is wasteful. I mean, this is where there would actually be a left wing detraction from the European Union. It's not being particularly environmentally friendly in this sense, in terms of its waste, in terms of the sort of regulations that arguably don't help the world's poorest people. I mean, there's a lot of left wing contentions about the European Union. Brexit's often dismissed as a right wing project, and it's true that some of the vocal figures like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson are from the right, but we shouldn't forget that some of the most vocal critics of the European Union in British history have been left wingers, people like Hugh Gaitskell in the past. I believe Michael Foot was also a staunch Eurosceptic, Harold Wilson for that matter. Let's not forget it was a Conservative Prime Minister that brought us into the European Union. But anyway, my I totally understand why the European Union began. The project was very noble. The idea that this was a continent that had torn itself apart, millions and millions dead over the centuries in brutal, bloody wars, including two world wars, the continent that had given so much culture to the world, the birthplace of democracy, had also torn itself apart. So the principles of the European Union back in the 50s were very good ones. And I suspect that's why we joined the common market in the 70s, partly also because of the decolonization era. The empire was gone. Um, but at some point, the federal focus on the European Union made people nervous, and understandably so. And another big thing about the European Union, and I suspect this is something that will be controversial because people, particularly on the left and so called liberals, have a knee jerk reaction to this. And the elephant in the room is issues about mass immigration and, frankly, pan-Islamism. Now, these two issues, when Angela Merkel made the decision to allow 1 million people into Germany and by definition, therefore, into the European Union at once. That may have been playing to domestic politics. It may have been for economic reasons. Whatever it was, it turned out to be profoundly reckless, and her party did suffer in regional elections as a result. It was, I would argue, her most controversial decision as Chancellor. Um, State enforced multiculturalism arguably has failed. And what I find really unfortunate is if you question this, if you say, look, these are the associated problems, then people have this knee jerk reaction like, oh, you're pandering to the far right, you're a neo nationalist, you're a white supremacist. I believe we should, as developed countries, help the world's most vulnerable people. I believe we should help genuine refugees. I believe that we should be open and tolerant countries. But I do not believe that we should. And I'm saying we, by the way, in a collective sense, because I believe fundamentally the same values apply in Western European states, indeed increasingly in Central and Eastern European states as well. That this shouldn't be a contradiction. We shouldn't have to say it's a choice between no immigration or mass immigration. There needs to be a common sense middle ground. And those who think that Brexit means, oh, the British are pulling up the drawbridge and we're going to be petty little nationalists, that is very misguided. In fact, if anything, we may see increased immigration from the Commonwealth. Um, I think we should help the most vulnerable people. But in the end of the day, anyone who believes that a blasphemer deserves to be brutally punished does not deserve to live in a liberal democracy. They clearly don't have those values. And this is something that the European Union not only failed to recognise as a body, there may be individuals within it who did, but as a body, I mean, that spate of terror attacks in France in 2015 and then later in Britain in 2017, and numerous other attacks in other countries in the interregnum, should have been a wake up call. And unfortunately, the result of this is that genuinely blood and soil nationalist types who have some pretty ugly politics, some of them are outright white supremacists, they capitalize on that because of the failure of leadership to recognize that there is a problem, because of the cowardly political correctness. Now, I suspect that the backlash against the European Union, and it's not that the EU is the only organisation that promotes this narrative, but it is one of the main ones, and there's a backlash against that. People see state enforced multiculturalism, they see the problems associated with it, and they see the EU as sitting there and not only doing nothing about it, but coming out with the same mantras like, we will be tolerant, we will be multicultural, the terrorists won't change our way of life. That's great, but at some point you have to recognize that cultures are different. And the problem with multiculturalism is it puts an equilibrium between Western liberal democracies and cultures that believe a woman should be stoned to death if she is raped. Now, there's simply no getting away from that. And the European Union, in my view, has utterly failed to recognise this. And as a result, far right groups and neo nationalist types have hijacked this, which is very unfortunate because some of them, in my opinion, are thugs. Okay, I have no time for some of these organizations, but I can see why they're rising. Because there is a very real perception that ordinary Europeans, people who are not blood and soil nationalists, people who are not racists, are being shamed simply for expressing concerns about these things. And that is wrong. And it's exactly the same issues in Italy, in France, in Germany, and across the continent, particularly in Western Europe. So the European Union needs to end this mentality that unchecked multiculturalism is a good thing. It's not. I'm not saying, by the way, that's the only factor of Brexit. I'm saying it is one of many factors. So to dismiss concerns as being racist, yes, there is racist attitudes out there. Yes, there is white supremacist mentalities out there. Yes, there are people, for example, when you get the likes of Katie Hopkins dehumanizing migrants, I thought that was disgusting. But those sort of attitudes are galvanized when there's perception that the elites, and that's not my expression, that's what critics would say, are not paying attention and they're not looking at the concerns that people have. It shouldn't take atrocity after atrocity to wake up and recognize that we do face a very real problem with pan-Islamism. And yes, there's a problem with the far right as well. But in terms of actual, to put it bluntly, a body count, more people have died in Europe from Islamist attacks in recent years than far right attacks. I mean, if we add it up, there was the Oslo attack, which was the worst example of a far right attack in recent years. There have been other attacks, but if we actually look at the numbers, the majority of victims have been from Islamist attacks, so it's not an equilibrium. Nevertheless, far right extremism will rise with the perception that governments and the establishment, for want of a better term, media organisations. I mean, as an example of this, that young woman who faced a tirade of death threats for no other reason than she reject the young French woman, she reject the sexual advances of this Muslim guy. The way France 24 was reporting that is a good example of the arrogance of the establishment. They were reporting it as a sort of, oh well, it's a dispute, like kind of presenting it as a moral equivalency. Oh, well, the death threats are wrong, but she shouldn't have offended the Muslims. This is insane. The idea that there's any moral equivalency at all is frankly repugnant. And France 24 isn't an organisation of the European Union, but they share the same sort of multicultural outlook, and they just don't grasp it. So the people who are angry over something like that are not far right neo nationalists. They're normal people like myself who recognise that this is an insane situation, that a 16-year-old girl can have thousands of anonymous men threatening to brutally rape and kill her because she said she dislikes Islam. It will take some moral courage for Europeans and anyone of goodwill, reformist Muslims as well, to simply speak out and say this is wrong. So I say the way that Europe goes forward, because we're out of the EU, but we're still going to have relations with our European neighbours. We will still, I hope, be working together on issues like counterterrorism. And I think that the way forward is to work with reformist Muslims to say, look, we are tolerant societies, but there is a real problem here with pan-Islamist ideology. And the European Union, frankly, has enabled that with its promotion of state-level multiculturalism. So I think that is a major factor. These are the reasons the European Union has lost one of its major member states. And if it doesn't wake up and start listening to Europeans instead of talking down to Europeans, this is going to happen again. I mean, it may be that some countries or some movements that are kind of wary of it could be, for example, that Eurosceptic movements in France and Italy are kind of looking at it and seeing how this works out before they make any push for a referendum themselves. But if Brexit is a big success for this country, they may well go down that line. And if the EU doesn't radically change its outlook, if it doesn't start to respect national sovereignty, if it doesn't start, stop conflating tolerance and diversity with enforced multiculturalism, then this is going to happen again. And the EU will have no one to blame but themselves. I don't take any pleasure from the collapse of the European Union. I really don't, because I do believe this is an organisation that started off with very noble principles. But I think, as much as I voted Remain, as much as I had big misgivings about Brexit, I totally understand why Brexit's happened. And it's not good enough to say, oh, the Leave side lied. Okay, they did tamper with figures, they did exaggerate certain things, but not all the criticisms about the EU were wrong. They weren't. Anyway, this is just my opinion. You don't have to agree. But the way I see it is, if you're truly someone who believes in democracy, human rights, and liberty, then you need to recognize that there is things going on in this world that are a threat to those values. And if you don't recognize what that threat is, and you simply jump on the bandwagon and label people racist, label people nationalists, you're not going to understand that. That doesn't mean that we can't also speak out against ugly blood and soil nationalist movements. I've seen some of these types, and I have no time for them. I am not their comrade in arms. I have no sympathy for some of the sort of things they're promoting. I mean, when you dig beneath the surface, their issue isn't just about people who don't abide by our values. It goes deeper than that, and I have no time for it. But centre ground, reasonable critique of state multiculturalism is absolutely justified and understandable. Criticism of Islam must be defended. The right to criticize Islam. Religion can be criticized, ideas can be criticized. It's not the same as attacking people and stirring up hatred against people. Criticism of Islam, dislike of Islam is legitimate, hatred of Muslims is not. That's how we need to look at this.